ask each of you in your opening remarks to just tell us a bit about your organization and what you do, and then we'll get into some more of the policy questions. So Sarah, can we just start with you?
Sure. So how many people are familiar with the United States Department of Energy? I'd say most of you are. So the Department of Energy manages and funds research, demonstration, and deployment on carbon capture and storage technologies, and as well as carbon dioxide removal. And we have done so for more than 23 years. One of my early projects in the beginning of my career at the National Energy Technology Lab was actually working on the very first roadmap for this technology. In my remarks, I will also be talking about some of the efforts the administration has taken from the White House level. So I recently am returning to the Department of Energy from a detail assignment I had at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. For those of you who are not familiar with the Council on Environmental Quality, it was established in the 1970s along with the NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, and the chair of CEQ is the president's principal advisor on all environmental issues. So in my remarks, you'll catch some of that as well as some things from a DOE perspective.
Hi, I'm Beth Valiaho. I am the Vice President of Strategy and Stakeholder Relations at the International CCS Knowledge Center in Canada. We founded our Knowledge and Lessons Learned about 7 years ago from the Sask Power Boundary Dam Carbon Capture and Storage Facility, the world's currently only operating large-scale facility on a coal-fired power plant, any power plant at this point, I guess. And we were expanding our learnings to input into all the projects that are moving forward. So especially in Canada right now, all of the 11 Emission Reduction Alberta Kickstart projects that are happening, including with the Canadian oil sands, the first 200 hours of input is covered. So we're really trying to make sure that projects don't start from scratch, that they avoid the pitfalls and mistakes that we saw at the Boundary Dam project, being a first of a kind project. And we're expanding beyond coal to cement, iron and steel, every sector really. And we really hope that we can help make sure your project's de-risked and ensure that, even all our engineers that say it's going to work, we've seen the other side of that. And Boundary Dam actually has captured 5 million tons to date and it's still operating. So we're there.
Well, good morning, everybody. Jeff, thank you to you and others at GCCSI for this opportunity. My name is Ben Wernette. I'm the Principal Scientist and Strategic Partnerships Lead for Southern States Energy Board. For the uninitiated, the board is a nonprofit interstate compact organization that consists of 16 southern states as well as 2 territories, those being Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The board is made up of governors from each of our member states, as well as a legislator from both the House and Senate. The board's ultimately supported by a staff, of which I'm a part, whose job really is to implement the board's broad mission, which is, broadly speaking, to improve quality of life in the Southeast. One of the ways we do this is through our carbon management program. Currently, we're spending a lot of time working with our industry partners throughout the Southeast, as well as legislators and academia partners to identify opportunities to deploy CCS technologies. Currently, we have 5 ongoing CCS RD&D projects, and we're proud to be in the process of negotiating an additional 3 projects as we speak, one of which was announced Friday of last week. So looking forward to the discussion here today.
Thank you. Adam.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Sweet. I'm the director for Western Canada for a group called Clean Prosperity, based out of Toronto. We are a small team that is focused on analysis and advocacy to enable a low carbon economy in Canada, and to ensure that Canada continues to be able to compete for investment attraction and economic growth. We do a lot of analysis, for example, on investment attraction, particularly with the IRA, how that's impacted Alberta's ability to attract low carbon growth, but also the impact of things like CCS. We really believe that the path forward is to harness the free market and to enable ways for Canada to be able to reach net zero by 2050. And as a personal note, It's really exciting to be back in DC. My last time I was here was in 2006. I was an intern at the embassy in Canada, and it's nice to be on a panel instead of delivering coasters to every senator and congressperson's office in August. So this is thank you for having me back.
Great to have you here. Throughout the panel, I'll be asking questions about what's going on in your jurisdiction. And so from a federal level, primarily Adam and Sarah, and from a provincial and state level, Ben and Beth, but feel free to jump in. I know you've got a lot, all of you have a lot of knowledge about what's going on in all of the jurisdictions that are represented here. So feel free to respond to others as we're talking about them. So let's start with federal policy. I know this won't be new to a lot of you in the room, but let's just level set and make sure we understand the kind of the high level commitments and actions and investments that the respective governments have made. And for Adam and Sarah, let's start with the Paris Agreement for the countries and work down from there. What are the major elements of policy in your jurisdictions that affect carbon capture and storage?
Please.
So I'm going to talk about 4 things, and I will, at Jeff's suggestion, start with the Paris Agreement. I'm also going to talk about the work that the Council on Environmental Quality has done, which sets the stage for the administration's position and work on ensuring whole of government approach to responsible CCS. And then I'll talk about, I mean, we can't not talk about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, but because we've already heard a lot about that, I'll keep that short. So, you know, first of all, the president has set an ambitious goal of carbon-free pollution power sector by 2035 and net zero emissions economy-wide no later than 2050. I think the big news is last month during the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate, the president highlighted a need for additional action in 4 areas: decarbonizing energy, ending deforestation, reducing non-carbon greenhouse gases, and carbon management. So the carbon management effort, the president announced a global carbon management challenge with a goal of a strong pipeline of projects by 2030. For additional details, there's a White House fact sheet and also a chair's summary from the meeting. But I will highlight that so far, 10 countries have committed to participating in this effort. They are Australia, Canada, Egypt, the European Union, Japan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and the United States, also Norway and Denmark. And the hope is further action will be taken at the COP later this year, and hopefully more countries will join by then. So the second thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was the Council on Environmental Quality. For those of you who've been in this space for a while, does everybody remember the Use It Act? It passed in December of 2020. Thanks to the Use It Act, the Council on Environmental Quality has been doing a lot on CCS. So there was a report that is, you can easily find it by Googling White House CEQ CCUS report in June of 2021. That report and its key findings are probably the best articulation of the Biden-Harris administration's positions on carbon capture and storage. The second thing that CEQ did is issued guidance to the federal agencies on carbon capture and storage. That guidance is interim guidance, it's in effect, and it was released in February of 2022. It includes a number of activities, everything from considering programmatic NEPA actions, thinking about federal lands and pore space, to ensuring that some of the provisions, such as the interiors regulations for offshore storage, come through. So that's been a major effort at the White House level, convening the agencies together on the guidance and kind of checking in on how it's going. The last thing that the Council on Environmental Quality did, also required under the Use It Act, was announced the membership for 2 permitting task forces on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. One of them will focus on the issues that are unique to federal lands. The other will focus on all other lands. Those task forces are in the process of being chartered, but recently the chair announced the membership of those 2 task forces. So finally, not finally, was first the Inflation Reduction Act. I think many of you are here in the room because of the provisions and the expansion, the boost to the 45Q tax credit received under the Inflation Reduction Act. The highest dollar you can get is $180 a ton for direct air capture, but you don't get that boost unless you meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. They're also, and I know others will talk about this today, but the other, I think, big game changer in the Inflation Reduction Act for 45Q is the fact that it allows direct pay, and rural electric co-ops, nonprofits can get that direct pay for the full 12 years. And last but not least, an effort that's we've done a lot of work on at the Department of Energy are the provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So in sum total, there's about $12 billion for new carbon management efforts in the bipartisan infrastructure law. I'm just going to say that again, $12 billion. That's a lot of money. And we can talk about this all day, but I'm just going to highlight that the Department of Energy has already met milestones related to getting the funding out under the bipartisan infrastructure law. So funding opportunity announcements for direct air capture hubs, carbon dioxide transport, front-end engineering design studies, carbon capture and storage demonstrations, large-scale carbon capture pilots, and carbon storage validation and testing the funding opportunities have already been issued, and selections on some of those efforts will be announced throughout the year. And I'll leave it with that. I'm sure there's a lot more I could say, but that's I think a high-level summary.
Yeah, great start, Sarah. And I often talk about the long history of support that DOE has provided to carbon capture and storage, going back decades, back to R&D and the Carbon Safe program. But now it seems like we're kind of in the hockey stick period where the activity and the support from DOE has just accelerated dramatically just over the last couple of years. So we're looking forward to that continuing. Adam, over to you and talk about what's going on in federal Canada.
Certainly. So it's to reinforce the nonpartisan nature of our organization. I'm a former conservative press secretary for the environment federally, and now I'm going to be speaking about how great the Liberal government's steps on the environment have been. We have what's called the Emissions Reduction Plan in Canada, which is really driving the policy kind of approach that the federal government has been taking. But I think the biggest acceleration has actually been the Inflation Reduction Act in the States. Last fall, our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, actually announced that we had to find a way to respond to the $1 trillion in carrots and the kind of incentivization that was coming from the United States. And so in our most recent budget, or in our country's most recent budget rather, in March, there was a commitment to pursuing carbon contracts for difference, which are really critical in Alberta to enable CCS. The other piece I think that's an important part to understand from the lay of the land is we have a federal system that creates a backstop on emissions reduction, but each province then has to, particularly on industrial emissions, take their own approach to how they address that. In Alberta, we've taken an approach called the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Plan, which is our carbon credit market. One of the reasons why I'll talk a lot about Alberta is, in a Canadian context, 55% of all industrial emissions in Canada come from Alberta. And about, I think, 40% of Canada's total emissions just writ large are from Alberta as well. So when we start talking about carbon capture and storage, it's a really critical piece, not just from a provincial context, but also from a federal one. Also in budget 2021, I believe it was, and Beth, you can correct me if I'm off on this. We announced, so there was an announcement for an investment tax credit around carbon capture and storage, which was implemented in 2022. That was really focused on how do we achieve 15 megatons of carbon capture and storage in the very near future. And so there's a really active engagement on the Canadian side. I'd suggest that the vast majority of that in the Alberta context is that carbon price that is tied to the federal backstop. But we know that the government is seized on how do we ensure Canada remains competitive with the Inflation Reduction Act, continue to attract that investment.
Yeah, we had a workshop with the province of Alberta a couple of months ago, and what we heard again and again was this competitiveness that was happening. And I think if by design or by accident. I think that's a really positive competitiveness that folks are, it's a race to the top in the sense of ensuring there's policies in place to support technologies like CCS. Beth, why don't you follow that up with a bit more detail on what's going on in Alberta and other provinces in Canada?
Sure, my pleasure. So, the way that you look in the states at primacy and giving, the states their ability to govern their own storage, there's a lot of that happens in Canada as well. And what we do there, it's called equivalency, and it's on climate. I'm first and foremost a climate change lawyer, so I'm a bit of a nerd on that side of it. But understanding how the federal government impacts the provinces really is an important step. The way that the investment tax credit that Adam was speaking to works for and applies to all of the provinces is only on the capital. So unlike the tax credit that's happening in the United States, which is a production tax credit, the investment tax credit is going towards 50% of the capital that happens on these projects. But what ends up happening is what happens for the operating costs and how do we continue that these projects continue to move forward? And so it's honestly a bit of a Band-Aid approach, the way that Canada and the provinces have had to harmonize and figure out what they're going to do to move forward. And that's what's drove and enabled the provinces to figure out how to make things work. Adam spoke about carbon contracts for differences as one of the solutions to try and guarantee what that carbon price looks like. By 2030, the carbon price in Canada is supposed to be $170 Canadian a ton, which is what, $50 US? I don't know. In any case, it's not 85. It's not equivalent to the production tax credit. But that was kind of the break-even point that we saw when we did modeling, especially out of Alberta, that the carbon capture projects could actually be cost competitive. And that's kind of also why you see the investment tax credit stopping at 2030 and halving to only 25% of the capital, because the carbon price in the country can enable the projects to happen. So then what ends up happening in the provinces is you see programs like the Alberta Petroleum Incentive Program being refangled to try and incent for carbon capture and storage projects. And everybody is starting to move really quickly because there's a time limit, which also makes the provinces very afraid, because how are we going to get all of the projects to happen by that 2030 timeline? It ends up being like the Three Stooges trying to get through the door, which ends up driving up costs, time delays, labor constraints, supply chain issues. And then that's why the provinces are trying to come in and take a role. So in Alberta, again, there's different incentive programs. There are large feasibility feed study dollars going into these projects. Like I mentioned, the Carbon Capture Kickstart program from Emission Reductions Alberta in partnership. Everything is having to be in partnership at a time where the West is really fighting with the East in Canada. And it's unlike what I've really noticed being here in DC is that the federal government here in the States, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it really seems to take a really wide stance on what will impact America. But in Canada, when you go to Toronto or Ontario, in Ontario, Quebec, there's an entirely different viewpoint and stance because there's so much hydropower. There's so many other things. And so the diverse landscape of Canada is really making a divide on how we go forward. So if there is a production cap, for instance, on oil put on Alberta, it's not an emission reduction strategy. So things like that are really taking fold. Saskatchewan, I don't even know what to say, but I will say BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan are the only provinces that are enabled to get in the investment tax credit right now based on their storage equivalency. Well, allowability. So I can deep dive more. I would love if there were more CCS projects happening in Saskatchewan by 2030. I don't know. Basically, at this point, if nobody is in their feed study, I don't know how you're going to get those projects built and done.
That's great. So can you dive a bit deeper, or maybe it's Adam, on one particular approach they're taking in Alberta? Because I haven't seen it in the US.
Yeah.
Find it really interesting and perhaps something that we can learn from. And that is the storage tenure management process, in Alberta, which is kind of this in between a government directed approach and a market approach. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, so the Shell Quest project really was the way that we started to look at regulatory approaches for storage in Alberta. What ended up falling from that, of course, is a credit mechanism to get credits, carbon credits back, but also an entire monitoring, measuring, verification, and a post-closure stewardship fund, which was also attached. So as the projects started to develop, they had to put money away so that over time, if the project shut down or it moved forward, the government took the liability over time. So that was an assurance to the public that somebody is caring and going to monitor this forever, which was really important. But then what ended up unfolding from that also is that, there are 390 billion tons to be sequestered in the Alberta-Saskatchewan region. And there's a lot of hub opportunities that flow from that. So the government of Alberta created a competitive bidding process for licenses to the underground. And ultimately, the province owns that space. It doesn't go under your land forever into the bottom. The Crown owns it. And so the Crown then licenses operators to be able to use those. There's 25 of these hubs that have been issued. And so then it's a bit of a public good mixed with the ability to gain those emission reductions credits for the CO2 that's sequestered. Then contracts end up happening between the capturer, the transporter often, the investors, and the sequesterer to kind of share the emission reduction credits that come from sequestration. Does that answer your question?
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just add one comment about the carbon hub. So one of the things I think is really interesting, you're talking about all the folks having to come together, is that it has actually had to be almost a new business model approach where you have groups. So for example, in the Wabamun Carbon Hub, which is just west of my town or city of Edmonton, this is actually a carbon hub that'll have a cement producer, a power plant that are both going to be injecting into the same pore space, using a using Enbridge essentially to be pumping it in. And so they have actually had to approach it at the C-suite level with a different way of saying, how do we work together? We know that individually we can't do this, but together there's an opportunity for us to address this. And if when that comes online, that'll be 4 megatons of storage, which will essentially double the amount in Canada already active. So it's a big project, and it's moving very quickly. But I think it's really critical when we're having this conversation that it's not just what does government need to do, but what does industry need to do, and how are they going to approach working together?
All right. So Ben, thanks for being patient.
Sure thing.
Hopefully you've thought about this a lot because you've got a big job. You've got a lot of southern states that you're engaged with, SSAB is engaged with. Give us the highlights kind of across the region. And I will say that Ben and I talked earlier and he said, yeah, I don't know so much about California. So that's probably going to be mostly absent from Ben's remarks, just saying that we know there's a lot of activity going on in California. And I know there's plenty of folks in the room that can talk to that at the break.
That's right.
Ben, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think really following the lead of DOE and the federal government more broadly in this broader appetite for decarbonization, there's been a lot of activity in the Southeast. And I think generally speaking, you can kind of categorize it into two end members, one of which is legislative activity, and then the other is industry activity, supported in large part by DOE through various funding opportunities. And so a number of states throughout the Southeast, like Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and many others have begun the process of laying the groundwork for creating a regulatory basis for Class 6 wells and CCS programs more broadly in the Southeast. And this is pretty important because it provides industry with the confidence that there's a framework in place that allows them to move forward with this industry. We're also seeing tax incentives at the state level that are being developed as well. And more recently in Texas, there's introduced legislation to add CCS to the existing emissions reduction program, which would make CCS eligible for various tax incentives, grants, and loans through the state as well. I think even building off of that, Texas has really taken a leadership role in looking at how to lease pore space, in particular in the state waters of Texas, which has attracted a lot of industry, due in large part to the fact that you don't have the concerns of working with multiple landowners and pore space owners when you're thinking about developing a project. On the industry side of things, there are a number of companies in the Southeast doing a lot of really great work, one of which, of course, is Southern Company, who's a real leader in this space and looking at subsurface geology throughout the Southeast and thinking about storage opportunities and strategic locations. And that work not only benefits Southern Company, that benefits all industry that are co-located in different geographies around the Southeast. Another good example of that is of course, CarbonVert's work with Chevron and the Bayou Bend project as well. So again, I think there's a lot going on. There's kind of this feedback loop, but I think it's important for industry to continue this work as well, to signal to legislators that this is a real industry and something that should be acted on accordingly.
So a quick follow-up on that. You mentioned tax incentives. Are they typically additive to 45Q or do they replace 45Q?
Now, my understanding is that local state tax incentives are stackable with the 45Q tax credit.
Right. Very good. I want to go deeper on the subject of environmental justice. And again, thinking about the jurisdictions that you're representing. A quick couple minutes about the jurisdiction's approach to EJ as it relates to CCUS. Sarah, do you want to start with the federal government?
Sure. So I'm going to start at the higher level and then talk about what's happening at the Department of Energy. So many of you may have seen this, but if you didn't, on April 21st, the president signed an executive order that was aimed at revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all. This executive order did a lot of things, but one of the things that it did is it made it clear that the executive branch agencies, the pursuit of environmental justice is a duty and must be incorporated into their mission. It also directed the agencies to facilitate meaningful public participation and just treatment for all people in agency decision-making. So that's the big deal. At the same time as the executive order was signed, the administration also published the first environmental justice scorecard. So you can look up environmental justice scorecard. You can look at any of the executive branch agencies, click on them and see how they're doing on environmental justice, what activities they've done and how they're doing. It also announced some additional covered programs. So the president's Justice 40 initiative, which was launched as part of Executive Order 14,008, stated that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments would flow to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. As of right now, after the April 21st executive order, 470 programs across 19 agencies are covered. At the Department of Energy specifically, there's been a lot of great work on addressing environmental justice, particularly addressing environmental justice associated with our research and development program on carbon management. So there's one thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. There's a set of societal considerations and impacts guidance documents that the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management has developed. But perhaps most importantly, the bill funding that I mentioned, in addition to our future funding opportunities, are all requiring community benefits plans as part of submitting the proposals, and in implementation also encouraging community benefits agreements. In that, and this, I can't underscore, you can have something that's required as a part of a proposal and it might not mean anything, but that's not the case. 20% of the technical merit of a proposal is weighted on that community benefits plan. So it's not only being required, it's being given priority and importance and consideration in what efforts are selected and move forward. Thank you.
And what kind of feedback are you getting from project proponents, if any, about those requirements and the guidance document and the benefits, the community benefits plan?
So I can't say what I'm hearing from proponents because I'm only back at the Department of Energy last week, Monday. But I can say that I had the opportunity last month or the month before. I guess we're in May now, so it was in March. I had the opportunity to travel with Assistant Secretary Crabtree and Deputy Assistant Secretary Deitch, and was in some community meetings actually in California, and the mentioning and talking about the importance that community benefits and community plans were playing in the role was something that was extremely well received by the communities that we visited.
Mm-hmm. And can you follow it up at the state level?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think the emphasis on environmental justice is something that we certainly applaud. And I think when we're working with our industry partners now and thinking about projects, what we're now doing is looking at engaging early and often with communities that might be impacted. So we're going into chambers of commerce, we're bringing in local leaders, and we're trying to establish these networks of essentially community advisors that can help us navigate this process. The important thing to emphasize here is that the long investment that DOE has made in this space, I think has made our job as kind of organizers of these projects and engaging with communities much easier, because we have a lot of information that we can lean on. And so as CCS transitions from this commercial, or excuse me, this RD&D space to commercial, I think we're going to be leaning a lot on that previous investment as we're continuing to engage with communities, certainly.
As you engage with communities, who are those that they trust? And by the way, Adam and Beth, would like you to address that question as well. Who are the folks that they trust?
Yeah, so start with me. Yeah, so I think typically, again, we tend to start at the community level and reaching out to mayors, people that live in the communities. It's difficult for us to go into communities and tell folks what's best for them, because I live in Atlanta, right? And our footprint is the entire Southeast. So we really focus on building a strong local team that consists of academicians, again, folks with a vested interest in seeing the community succeed. We also too are starting to engage with NGOs nationally as well, because I think their voice is an important one as well.
Go ahead.
So I just want to add, one thing. I gave the anecdote of a couple of communities and community meetings, and I will just caution that, communities are complex, and especially when you're working in communities that are underserved, overburdened, the history associated with the industry that's in the area plays a role in how future efforts are viewed. And I think it's really easy sitting up on the stage to just talk about communities, even talk about environmental justice in this broad way. But when I've had the chance to meet with environmental justice leaders, their experience is really personal, and it's deep, and it's specific to the place that they're from, specific to the industries that they've engaged with before. And all of that comes to the table as we're talking about carbon management and, really thinking through, talking about alternatives to proposed action early in the process. As Ben said, early engagement, that's, certainly important now and will be important going forward as well.
And I just want to add to that. I think making it clear to communities that they're involved in the project process is also really important.
Adam, why don't you start out from a policy perspective, environmental justice in Canada?
So it is as it is with any, with any issue of justice, there's multifacets to it. And Canada is an incredibly diverse country, but it's also important, I think, to remember that we are a small country. 90% of Canadians live within 150 miles of the US border. Half of the rest live in my city of Edmonton. And so if you picture all of Canada and you start to think about, 5% of Canadians spread across this vast land, there are elements of, how do we address the change, how do we address the impacts of climate change? There are 1 million acres that have already been burned in Alberta in this wildfire season that's just started, which is, I think, about the same size as Rhode Island. So we have a very prominent piece that's there, but we also have an issue of ensuring continued accessibility and affordability of energy. So there are multifacets that we're always wrestling with, and we also add in an element of continuing the process of truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. In Alberta, it's a really critical piece. We are treaty peoples in the province, and so how we address not just environmental justice, but economic justice as well, and ensuring participation in these projects. So it's not just an outsider coming in and creating a carbon capture storage project, but actually actively working with the First Nations that are there. I think those are some really kind of key pieces, but we also, when we talk about that social license, we are fortunate in Alberta in that, we do have a very long history with energy. Our hockey, if I can't be Canadian and not mention hockey at some point on a panel, our team name is literally the Oilers. So we have a different kind of relationship with the energy sector. But we also have a really different relationship with the low carbon economy. Just northeast of Edmonton is a place called the Alberta Industrial Heartland, which if you haven't heard about, I encourage you to take a look at, where we're seeing a huge investment in low carbon economic growth, where we see carbon capture and storage. They're pumping it right into the pore space directly underneath them. But one of the things that's interesting is that the communities that surround them pretty much all work there. And so that engagement, that participation in the process, you have that social license basically baked in. And so it's a different kind of conversation. Now, when you go to the rest of Canada, particularly into Quebec and Ontario, there's going to have different views of how, we haven't been able to get pipeline. I have to be careful with this. It's a challenge to be able to build pipelines in Canada, which when you start having conversations about hydrogen development, for example, or trying to get ammonia to Prince Rupert, which has a natural advantage accessing Asian markets over the Eastern Seaboard, how do we start to move that through? It is a very active conversation that is really, really tricky.
And before we go to Beth, just a reminder to the audience that you can submit your questions by Slido, and in just a minute, we're going to start picking your questions instead of mine. Beth?
Yeah, so maybe I'm going to echo something near the end, but I want to say first that the investment tax credit is a really great way that environmental justice and in a broader approach is attached to money. So the government has strings attached to what they're trying to issue. So not only is there climate risk disclosure reporting required of the when you get the investment tax credit, there's also knowledge sharing reporting that has to come from that. And that doesn't just include the wonderful lessons learned of all of the projects. It also includes stakeholder engagement and different considerations. And you have to submit that or you get a $2 million penalty there's a course of 6 reports. So that's really important as well. It's a different conversation, as we're saying, in the West, in the southern community of Estevan, Saskatchewan, where the Boundary Dam, basically almost in North Dakota, but it's over 20 years, there has been CO2 coming from North Dakota into southern Saskatchewan, and it is safely stored. It is monitored, measured, everything. It is a beautiful proven case study for all of you, especially in Louisiana, if you need to have neutral, fact-based, trusted people coming down to explain this is done, it's proven, it's secure. And so when people trust, you asked, who do people trust? Pathways Alliance, which is the oil sands, did a polling to find out, is Canada Climate Action, like where do they fall? Low. Different NGO groups, where'd they fall? Low. But the International CCS Knowledge Center, and I feel like it was a plug almost, became really high in the polling because of fact-based neutral science that shows proven results on how these things move forward. When I went down to Estevan and spoke to the Union Hall on the coal plant, we had the people in the community, the men were crying and in this meeting and saying, where am I going to take my kids? Where am I going to go when you shut all of this down? And so when you talk about environmental justice, there's a community aspect that in these communities like Edmonton and in different places, it's not, we don't want this in our backyard. It's please give this to me. So there's a big difference when you link this, as the governor of Louisiana said, to jobs, investment, and the economy and the future of your community. And we've seen it time and time again. And I hope that we don't lose the Boundary Dam carbon capture and storage facility because it's on coal and all of coal is being shut down, even though those emissions are being reduced, and trying to figure out how we're going to have these projects continue into the future. One last thing I'll say, I know I got the stop. One last thing I'll say is that expected performance that you're expecting to do and your nameplate capacity, be careful because we all have ambitions, but you always will be compared to what your actual performance results are. And that, in terms of environmental justice and people having buy-in for carbon capture and storage, has been an issue for Boundary Dam that we have tried to figure out for 8 years, because it's a 1 million ton a year nameplate capacity. But it's only been 5 million tons sequestered over 8 years. That doesn't add up, right? But 95% of the emissions that go into the carbon capture facility are captured. So I just want to explain that, be careful, and that will help in the future as we communicate what carbon capture and storage projects look like.
Great. All right, we're going to audience questions. And you don't feel obligated. We only have about 15 minutes, so don't feel obligated to answer each one. But certainly, as you feel compelled, please do. What are the permitting reform priorities for the administration for CCUS projects, including capture? And I think this is for the folks with the U.S. government. Sarah, in particular, how about coordination between EPA, DOE, DOI, and others?
So two things I can mention. I talked about the guidance that the Council on Environmental Quality issued, which reiterates the whole of government approach to responsible CCS. As part of implementing that guidance, about a year ago, we stood up an interagency working group on CCS at a high level. The Department of Energy also, for a really long time, has had a staff level working group of civil servants that exchange information. And just last week, there was an interagency training on CCS modeled after the REX program that was held at the National Carbon Capture Center. And I understand in feedback from talking with folks, it was tremendously successful and a really good effort. So I will say that the agencies are working together. They are coordinating. I won't talk about permitting reform per se, but I will say I did mention those permitting task forces that were required under the Use It Act, which passed in December of 2020. Those permitting task forces, as the Use It Act specified, will be preparing reports that will be submitted to the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, and they will be identifying opportunities for improving permitting for CCS from a perspective of efficient, orderly, and responsible CCS.
Okay. To the Canadians, what are the other provinces in Canada on storage regulations? What are the barriers? Can Canada achieve its goals without Ontario and Quebec?
Do you want me to answer?
Carbon.
You take a crack.
Yeah, so in Ontario and Quebec, there is about 8 billion tons of storage. Most of it's under the Great Lakes. That's the main barrier. But also there's moratoriums on drilling. So Ontario just opened up its moratorium on storage and the ability to store, but there's still no regulations put in place. Quebec doesn't have that open right now. So that's the barrier. There is no storage really, and there isn't the ability. That doesn't mean that there's not an ability to pipe into Michigan, for instance, or other places. This is something that we've done in the West. And so ultimately, that's what you're seeing. There is some potential opportunity offshore in Atlantic Canada that we're seeing, but the emissions just aren't there. So there's a high cost, and costs come down with economies of scale. So smaller facilities, when we start to get modularized CCS and those types of opportunities into the future, there may be more options.
Mm-hmm. Right. Next question, how do you ensure or measure that 40% of benefits will flow to disadvantaged communities when individual projects aren't required to meet this requirement? I think that's a Sarah question. Maybe Ben might have a perspective on that.
Sure. So there is a team at the Department of Energy and throughout the government who is working on tracking and measuring this, and happy to provide resources through the GCCSI that point you to the information about that. But I don't have a specific example, other than a tremendous amount of thought and effort has been put into this. And you should check out the scorecard that I mentioned, which provides more detail on an agency, not on a project by project basis, but on an agency by agency basis.
Yeah, I believe the 40%, that's programmatic, correct? So not for individual projects. At any rate, when we're developing programs, I mean, we really try to maximize the geography where DOE dollars are flowing. And so that's through establishing different communities of thoughts by working with different minority serving institutions that are interested in CCS, and really kind of beefing up the broader outreach and education components of these projects, which I think is going to be critical for us moving forward.
All right. Regarding the Canadian carbon tax, how do you reconcile taxing domestic industry while remaining competitive against high greenhouse gas importers that pay no carbon tax?
So we start talking about carbon border adjustments. It definitely gets tricky. I think there's a really active discussion right now in Canada around the carbon tax. But we have we keep trying to, as Clean Prosperity, remind folks that there's a distinction between the consumer carbon tax and the industrial output-based pricing system, which is where Alberta's system kicks in. And so we actually have found, as Clean Prosperity, we released a report at the end of February, taking a look at the competitiveness of Alberta, actually of Canada writ large, but particularly Alberta, given that we represent that 55% of industrial emissions, taking a look at how do our industries remain competitive with the Inflation Reduction Act. In hydrogen, for example, in blue hydrogen, we actually found that currently, if you were to set up for those of you who know about Air Products, the project in Alberta, if you were to set up a new one in Texas through the IRA, you would get about $1 a kilogram per hydrogen produced. If you were to set it up in Alberta, currently with the ITC on carbon capture, you get about 7 cents a kilogram. And even with the hydrogen tax credit stacked, which is not stackable, but if you could, it'd be 9 cents. This is about $464 million per year to the bottom line of an investor, or sorry, of a company that's looking to do that. However, the carbon price, while often seems like a stick, actually creates an incentive through the carbon credit market. If you can create certainty through that the carbon price will continue to escalate to $170 a ton in 2030, you actually create a situation in which an investor knows that they can sell those credits for a certain price. The uncertainty exists by whether or not that's going to shift. And so we have been advocating for a carbon contract for difference that kind of acts like crop insurance, where there'll be a guaranteed price set for those credits in 2030. If you create that, we'll actually be at about $1.02 a kilogram. And so now we're into a different conversation. Now we're having a conversation of, do you want to be setting up in the States or in Canada because of that certainty? So we look at this and say, it doesn't always have to be production tax credits or carrots. It can also be, how do you avoid the stick as an incentivization? But that has to be everybody being very clear and open and transparent around how they're trading those carbon credits. So that's I think a piece that that helps to address that.
So Adam, you gave me an opening that I was hoping for, which was hydrogen. And I did want to understand a bit more about how the different jurisdictions are both incentivizing and perhaps regulating hydrogen, particularly as it relates to blue hydrogen, hydrogen associated with carbon capture and storage. So can I start on the US side with Sarah and talk just for a minute about what's going on policy-wise with hydrogen?
Sure. So I've mentioned a lot about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the historic investments for hydrogen. It's $8 billion for hydrogen hubs. One of them will be associated with fossil energy, at least per the statute. We also have in the tax credit, we talked a lot about 45Q. Well, there's 45V for hydrogen. Whether 45Q is more lucrative will depend on the specifics of a project. So if you have fossil energy, if you have hydrogen produced with fossil energy, the analysts tell me that 45Q is likely going to be more lucrative. However, it's going to depend on the carbon intensity of your hydrogen. So if you're blending, biomass or other biogenic sources of hydrogen with your fossil hydrogen, it may be that the 45V tax credit ends up being more lucrative at a time on a case-by-case basis. So lots of activity, lots of incentives, and I'll leave it at that.
Anything to add?
Yeah, sure. This is another good example of states reacting to federal investments. I think Oklahoma in particular has recently passed legislation incentivizing CO2 capture associated with the production of blue hydrogen. I think too, this is another area where you're seeing industry in the Southeast really kind of take charge and lead the way. There are a number of associations like the Texas Hydrogen Association, as well as the Georgia Hydrogen Brain Trust, which was established under the guidance of Senator John Ossoff. So again, a lot of activities in this space, and other companies like Southern as well are demonstrating hydrogen blending in natural gas units as well. So it's an exciting time.
Adam, do you want to say more about hydrogen federally?
Sure. So we actually just had a major hydrogen conference in Edmonton. We had about just shy of 2,000 people that came. It was a really active conversation. There's a gentleman from GE Power who spoke. When you look at hydrogen, whether you're talking about green or blue or any of the different colors, really focus more on the low carbon or the carbon intensity. And the conversation was about really focusing less on the approach and starting with location. You know, it's location, location, location. Do you have the ability to produce the hydrogen with renewables, such as in Ontario or Quebec, where you have that hydropower? Or if you're in the West, do you have that pore space where carbon capture and storage makes sense? That's a really key piece. One piece, though, that we are concerned about as Clean Prosperity is how do you also create an export market to be able to get the most value you can for that product? That's something that continues, I think, the governments still have to wrestle with. Whether that is a pipeline or whether you're having a conversation about trains. We do know how to do ammonia on trains. It's about 300,000, I think, or so per car. We aren't quite as there yet with hydrogen. It's about $1 million a car is what CN Rail has been saying. And so how do you not just, we can figure out how to create it, but how do you make sure that you can export it and get out to global markets to get that price that makes the investment make sense?
Yeah, I just add that when the budget came out in 2023, they, besides the CCUS investment tax credit, a bunch of other investment tax credits were also launched, one of which being the clean hydrogen investment tax credit. As Adam mentioned before, you can't use it and the CCUS tax credit, but in order to any hydrogen made from natural gas processes, have to have CCS attached in order to get the investment tax credit. What's also really interesting is they did a consultation at the same time, and maybe reflective of the Inflation Reduction Act, that 30% of the project is a labor consideration. So you actually can lose 1/3 of your investment tax credit if you don't meet certain labor requirements. So I'd just add that in.
Okay, last question. We've got about 60 seconds. So one sentence. What advice would you give CCS developers in both countries to gain public support to onshore storage? Sarah, let's start with you and work down the line.
The goal of your community engagement will not guarantee public support, but doing it right, listening to the community, talking to them early, working with them to identify alternatives, options, hear what their concerns are, will help improve the project.
Great. Beth?
It will be all onshore storage will be the piece, but I would say, community engagement, town halls, education sessions, proven, transparent, all of those things that go in line with that is very, very important, and being able to answer the questions that people have in the community and get out before they have all of the questions, to be honest, because once you ask questions, you've lost the argument.
Yeah, I think where appropriate, working with long-standing research entities with experience in the space is going to be critically important. This is primarily because there's a track record of success that can provide unbiased opinions and information to stakeholders at all levels.
Thank you. Adam?
So I coach my son's U9 soccer team, and the same thing I would say to them is the same thing I would say here, which is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen as twice as much as you're going to talk in any of these conversations.
There you go. Well said. All right. Well, I want to thank the panelists and invite you to thank them as well. It's been a great conversation.